Today I'm joined by Ben Veras, CEO and co-founder of Kateri Carbon. Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm super excited about, what Kateri does. Carbon is markets and carbon credits. It's something that I know something about, but not a ton about. So excited to really dive more into this topic. But before we get too deep into anything, in simple terms, could you describe what is Kateri Carbon? When did you start the company? What is the main product? And what are the ways it provides values to the customer?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the simplest terms, Kateri is a carbon project developer in the grassland space. So what that really means is that we work with large landholders, primarily ranchers, and we'll get more into those details. And we help them generate carbon credits, which is a little bit more complicated than it sounds, but includes getting that carbon into the soil, verifying and validating that it is there, and then packaging those as carbon credits, which we then sell on to larger companies. That helps the ranchers get paid, and it helps those companies meet their environmental targets. We started the company just over a year ago. So we started formally in May of 2023, but the company is actually a carve out or a spin out from another company. So I worked prior in the cattle space, in particular on a livestock hardware company that we can get into the details of. And that company got acquired. And during the acquisition, we agreed to carve out this portion of the company. So in a way, Kateri is 3 years old, but formally just over a year.
Got it. You sort of alluded to it quickly, but what is your sort of background and what drew you to this particular both the carbon credit space and then in more detail, the carbon credit space for ranchland?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I started my career on the finance side as most you Chicago undergrads go through. I started my career at Citadel and then Goldman Sachs. Realized I was not going to be a long-term finance person. God bless all the Wharton kids who continue through the battle. And I went over to McKinsey to do a few years of management consulting, really figure out what industries I was interested in. And I found myself down the pathway of what they call advanced industrial. So that's everything from construction and mining to aerospace and defense, automotive, kind of the, what I call the tangible industries. And I really find a lot of fascination in things that have solidified real tangible impacts. I think there's a lot of really smart folks working on SaaS, and I understand it from the VC valuation standpoint, all that, but I do think we still need roads and bridges. And so found myself in that space for a while at McKinsey, and then eventually hopped to smaller and smaller startups. So first I joined a company called Aurora, which is a large autonomous vehicle company, and joined that just after the Series A and went through the IPO there, and then jumped ship to a smaller startup called Vents, which I mentioned earlier in the call. That was a virtual fencing. It's a hardware company for cattle, allows you to manage cattle using their GPS location. We can get into the details of that hardware, but really gave me that first exposure. So I came from the hardware side, not from the ranching side or even necessarily the climate side, but I was very excited when interviewing with that company about the potential for the climate side. We grew the business, we grew the hardware side, but then we realized that, again, the climate angle was going to be a really exciting addition and add-on. It was a way we were looking at a growth vertical for that company. And during the acquisition, we determined that the acquirer wasn't really interested in pursuing that pathway. And so that led to the spinoff that we have today. Got it.
Very interesting career path. Taking a bit of vacation going to McKinsey is not often what a lot of people say. So that's definitely a new one for me. So, kind of spinning back to Kateri Carbon, you sort of mentioned, part of what you guys do is helping ranchers get the carbon into the ground and then ultimately sort of generate credits from their land and from that carbon. Could you maybe break down sort of what the process is when you say getting the carbon into the ground, and then maybe how you actually go about generating the credits on the back end?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the thing to know at a high level is that, when people think about cattle and they think about the emissions from cattle, they often think about the methane, right? That's the number one picture most of us have. Cattle actually have an environmental impact in two ways. One is the methane, and two is what they do to grasslands. So cattle are in some ways a lazy animal. They'll sit on the same piece of grass and they'll keep eating it if they're allowed to, right? If they're not forced to move, cattle will stay in the same place and they'll eat the grass until it's to a nub. And that can actually kill the grass. The roots will shrink and will go into effectively a survival mode, right? And this means that it releases a lot of its carbon and it will never regrow. And you can think about grasses are just like trees. The same way that people have been planting trees have deep root systems. They pull in lots of carbon dioxide out of the air. And so grasslands, they cover tremendous amounts of space on Earth. 26% of all land on Earth is used by livestock. And I think that's some fact that a lot of us don't really think about because most of us are in cities, but tremendous amounts of land, hundreds of millions of acres in the United States, South America, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, all of, Central and Northern Australia. Huge landscapes are used by livestock and particularly cattle for most of those parts. And these are all these tremendous ecosystems that can be recovered and replenished if the cattle are managed correctly. And the way you do that in very simple terms is called rotational grazing. By moving the cows more frequently, they'll do what's called take half, leave half. They'll eat half the plant and then they'll move. They stomp in manure, they move seeds around, they help trim off bad leaves, and they allow more sunlight to get in between plants. So you can actually grow grass faster and more healthy grass with cattle than you can with no cattle. So if you removed all the cattle, it wouldn't necessarily be better, right? But it requires this really diligent effort. And so we work with ranchers to give them the tools and the knowledge and the data to be able to move those cows frequently. And then in terms of validating and actually issuing the credits, what we do is we take a baseline soil measurement. So we take thousands of cores of soil down to a meter. We send those off to a lab and they can actually quantify the amount of carbon. We look at some other things as well. Then basically every 3 to 5 years, we'll come back and resample that soil. So we can actually physically quantify statistically on every property how much carbon is in that soil. And that's what allows us to issue carbon credits. So for however many tons of carbon we capture, the rancher gets those issued in credits. This is a process that's verified by a number of the large registries. So there's these kind of groups called carbon registries. They're really third parties that say this is officially a credit, right? You don't want a company itself justifying its own credits, or that kind of can lead to some greenwashing potentially. And so there's these third parties. The biggest one's called Verra. And so we use a protocol called VM32 under Verra. There's some other large ones like the Climate Action Reserve, which is specifically US focused or North American focused. And they have one called the SEP, the Soil Enrichment Protocol. So there's really guidelines. They're like 200-page documents, and you really have to go through all these steps to really verify and quantify what work you've been doing. And we do that all on behalf of the rancher, and then we sell the credit. And that sale of the credit is what allows us to pay for all this work. The soil sampling is incredibly expensive. We spent, over $1 million on that process so far, getting ranch advisory, getting tools like the virtual fencing hardware in the field. All these things are expensive, but the carbon is well worth the amount to cover that. And the rancher also gets a new income stream on top of that.
Super interesting. Is there also like an operational impact or benefit to the farmers of having more grass and like more readily available like grazing land, or is that not really a big component for them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that we try to emphasize with our program is that we're not asking them to do something that they wouldn't want to do just in exchange for the carbon, right? It's not saying, oh, you take this penalty, but you get some carbon payments in exchange. This should be stuff that really benefits their property anyways. The thing is, there's a barrier to entry to this just because either the technology, the knowledge, the data, or just having the resources to move the cows. Moving cows every few days or every week is just a lot of effort. And the big thing is you need lots of fences historically. That's why the virtual fencing technology has really unlocked this. Is just historically you have to cross fence your property. And our average property in our program right now is 12,000 acres. For general perspective, Manhattan's 13,000 acres. So our average property is about the size of New York City. Right. And so to cross fence that and to build out the pastures is really expensive. 1 mile of fence out in the countryside is about $20,000. And so these properties usually would need to spend about $500,000 on fencing just to try to get the pastures where you can move the cows. And then the grasses change and you'd have to redo it. So it's just way too expensive and cumbersome to do that. And so even though they know it's good for their grasslands, they just haven't been able to do it. And carbon is really what's unlocking that by providing them the financing and the knowledge to do so. And yeah, it does help improve their grasses, which allows them in theory to add more cattle to the ground. And to them, cattle is profit. Every animal is profitable as long as the grasslands can maintain it.
You mentioned in sort of your beginning description of, helping the farmers get the carbon credits or the carbon into the ground, tools and products and technologies that you guys have to help them do that. Can you maybe sort of like double click into that and sort of, is it stuff that you guys have built internally, or are you more sort of, taking products and tools available on the market and sort of providing sort of like the service layer on top of it to go ahead and provide that to the farmers?
Yeah, it's more similar to the latter. And this is for us, there's also always a point of discussion around what do you vertically integrate over time. And so there's really a lot of things that we're an integrator for. So the first is soil sampling. It doesn't make sense for us to get in the soil sampling business. That requires huge amounts of CapEx up front, and that's a huge business itself. And there's a lot of really wonderful companies that are competing aggressively to do that, which is great for us. More competition means that the prices have been really stable on that and really quite affordable. So we work with, quite well-funded companies like Yardstick and Earth Optics. So Yardstick's backed by Breakthrough Ventures, the Bill Gates and Microsoft funds. They have money from Microsoft. Earth Optics raised, I think, a 30 million Series B. So these are quite well-established businesses. And so they will come out and take the cores. They will send them to the labs. They have lab partners. They can do all the quantification. They GPS tag every single one of them. It's a really, really well-oiled machine. So again, it doesn't really make sense for us to do that ourselves. And then there's basically the hardware that goes on the cattle that allows us to move them and GPS track their location so we can really understand how the cattle are moving. Again, Vents was the company I worked for. They got acquired by Merck Animal Health. So Merck Animal Health is a division of Merck, the pharmaceutical company. Again, a quite large company. Building that hardware took, a decade. The company was 7 years old when it was acquired. Those are all types of, things that don't really make sense for us to do. But we have data agreements with all these companies, and we then pull that. So we work with 5 or 6 different companies that have different integration and in-field technologies. And then we integrate that into a platform. So internally, it's called Data Barn instead of like a data lake or anything. So we have the Data Barn, pulls into all these unique data sources. And then we have our app. So our app's called Hermes. Hermes was kind of obviously people know him as like the god of travelers and other things, but he was also the god of boundaries and also was a shepherd. So we like the image of Hermes. And so our app, they can basically log in and they can see their soil samples. They can see their cow's location. They can see, based on our ranch advisor's advice to them, when their next movement should be and what pasture they should go to. So it really gives them an all-in-one place where they can make that thing. We are thinking about potentially even selling that beyond carbon players because it could be valuable to ranchers even if they're not going to be in the carbon program. But for now, we've kept it just to our existing customers.
Got it. And in terms of, the physically moving of cattle, is that, just old school, like cattle dogs, or is there any sort of new technology kind of going on in that world also?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's really 2 parts. Ultimately, you'll always need cowboys, you'll need range riders, and you'll need people to engage with the animals. But one of the other things that, again, I mentioned was this virtual fencing technology. So it's basically a collar that goes around the animal's neck, and it uses their GPS location, and you can set boundaries, right? So you can set new fence lines that aren't physical fence lines. And then it uses a combination of sound. So it basically plays a sound for them for about 10 meters. And then it's a shock zone. So it's a similar voltage as a hot wire. So normally cows are kept in with hot wires or barbed wire. And instead you can create an infinite variation of fences. And what you can do is you can basically have that line move, or you can open up gates. And cows are constantly kind of testing that area because they're always looking for the next, bit of grass once they've eaten in a certain field, or they're looking for water or whatever their next move is. And so once you open up that line, they'll make the next move in general. They'll still go out there and generally move them. But once you open up a fence, the cows will walk to the next field pretty quickly. So,
and so from my understanding, let me just play it back to you. So me and the viewers kind of, or listeners understand what's actually happening is that you basically take all this data that you've aggregated from the soil samples, other sort of pieces that you gather. And then within the app is that you ultimately show the farmers both the raw data, but then ultimately what their fences should look like to enable this sort of like carbon recovery into the soil. Is that sort of like the end product, quote unquote, that a farmer would see?
Correct. Yep. So the idea is that they can log in, they can see their pastures. We have them go out and meet with the ranch advisor one-on-one. So we work with a number of ranching experts. They'll go out and say, okay, based on what I'm seeing in your different fields, here's how I would divide them up, right? Eventually we'll have algorithms that can maybe predict that better. You just need lots and lots of data to prove that out. And basically we'll work with them throughout the season. And there's things that are going to change so that they can call us, they can call the ranch advisor and say, hey, this field's not looking as good as we thought it would, right? And so how can we then say, okay, you know what, let's stay out of that field. Actually, let's let that one recover. Let's change this one. And so we can record that all on the platform. And then we can actually see, because we have the constant GPS streaming from the cattle, we get a data point for every cow every hour. And so if you have a herd of, say, 1,000 cows, we're getting 20,000 plus data points a day, right? And that allows us to build this really robust picture about where the cows are truly impacting the ground. And then we can see where the virtual fence lines are. We can see the soil sample data. We have cameras in field as well that can see the grass conditions, et cetera. And so we can really integrate that into a picture so the rancher can understand what's happening in their field and how it's impacting the carbon, which is also impacting their pockets.
Totally. In terms of, there's a couple of different components that you've mentioned is in terms of like how the advisory and sort of like the physical footprint of your business happens. So is it, basically every time you work with a new rancher, you literally have people go to the farm, or there's some sort of like physical component of people going to that ranch land to whether take samples or advise or view what's happening with that farmland?
Yeah, absolutely. There will always be some physical component to this, at least for the near term. I think data can allow us to continue moving away from that to some extent. And so right now, yes, partially it's just because we can get just better insights. The ranch advisor is just going to see things that you're not going to be able to see, for example, with satellites. Satellites are not going to be accurate enough to see the differentiation in types of grasses. So a grass called Idaho fescue on a satellite will look no different than Russian knapweed. One of those is much better for carbon capture than the other, right? And one of them is a much healthier plant. One of them is a weed, but on a satellite image, they may look the same, right? It's just not going to be granular enough to see the differentiation in those plants. So having someone go out there is always powerful. But also there's just the factor of what are the ranchers going to see? The ranches already, carbon credits are a pretty magical concept. They're happy to get paid for it. And they do understand soil organic carbon. That is something that they know daily because it's important for the growth of their plants, which is the growth of their cattle, which is, where their revenues come from. But at the same time, there's a really big aspect in trust building exercises with ranches to be able to have boots on the ground, to really understand them, to understand their ranches. If you just said, oh, our calculation told us you can get this much, just do this, move your cows here and we'll pay you. It really doesn't sink in with a lot of these folks. And so having that in-person aspect is really important. That's partly why we've started with really large ranches to date, is just that it's easier logistically, financially. There's a lot of things that make sense at that scale. The way that we'll get to smaller ranches is that eventually you have enough data that you can provide insights to them without having an advisor on the ground for all of them. Or you can start aggregating a bunch of small ranches that are near each other. All that stuff happens over time. Soil sampling is still expensive. There's a kind of a fixed minimum cost. And so if a ranch is 300 acres, it's pretty hard to go out there and do that sampling cost. If the price of carbon raises, then you can solve all of this, right? And so there's a balance of both the carbon prices and also just, data that will allow us to maybe, skip some of those steps.
Yeah. I think that's a good segue into sort of the next sort of line of question that I want to ask around more of the business model and sort of areas of growth for Kateri. The first is, I assume basically that the product only works with ranchers who are doing grass-fed cattle, right? So it's not necessarily a use case for, a big cattle producer that's doing sort of grain-fed cattle kept in confinement, or is it sort of available to everyone who's sort of and useful for everyone who grows or sort of does cattle?
Yeah, sure. So this is something you only learn really once you're in the industry. So every cow is grass-fed. Grass-finished is something different, but every cow is born onto what's called a cow-calf ranch. So there's basically mother cows, and they'll stay in the same ranch for 10 years. Every year they give birth to a baby calf. Those calves will stay on the property for 8 months to a year. And basically they're fattening them, and then they wean them off the mother cows, and then they sell them to what's called a stock or backgrounder ranch. And that's where they'll either gain more weight or be put into some specific use case. So they can be steers, or they can be, various yearling operations, et cetera. And basically those cows will gain a lot of weight on grass. They'll get up to 1,000 pounds maybe, and then they're sold off to feedlots. And then the feedlot is where they'll eat grain. They'll be in smaller confined areas, and they eat a lot of corn and grain, and they gain weight really quickly. So every cow starts off the majority of its life, and actually a majority of its emissions are on grasslands. The feedlot is really just a finishing stage. Some cows don't go to the feedlot, and they're actually finished fully on grass, and that's where you pay more for grass finished. They usually just call it grass fed because it's an easier concept. But to be clear, every cow is fed grass actually for the majority of its life. Weight gain perspective, most of the weight gain is on the grain at the end. They don't get a lot of they're not moving as much, and they can feed them a lot, right? So our product is primarily targeted at that cow calf because those tend to be where they have the most space and there's the most land. And ultimately, we are capturing carbon per acre. That's the unit that we look at. We look at tons per acre, right? And so if you're on bigger acreage that you can solve, we do work with a number of yearling and stalker operations as well. There's nothing limiting about that. There's nothing about the dynamics of the cattle that would change it. It just tends to be that the larger landscapes we work with are cow-calf operators.
Sure. In terms of, thinking about how you guys go out and acquire new clients, is it sort of what's your go-to-market operation look like? Is it more of a network base? I'm sure a lot of people, it's a small community. A lot of people know one another, or sort of kind of curious how that actually works.
Yeah. I mean, the ranching industry is incredibly built on trust, right? That's something that's really important. These folks aren't really engaging as much with, TV ads and, whatever else. There's podcasts they listen to. I'm not sure if they're on the Wharton Tech Talk one yet, but we'll get them there. But, a really big part is that in-person trust and understanding, their local, they have these things called cattlemen's roundtables. They have nonprofits they work with. There's, groups like the NRCS. That's basically a U.S. government organization that has someone in every county where there is agriculture. And so a lot of it really is these trust circles. And what we'll often do is look for people who are leaders in their community, because if they do something, a lot oftentimes people in their community will follow them. And so, we're active in 12 states right now, and we're often with some of the largest ranches in each of those states. And you really build that trust, and that expands. We also work with local nonprofit partners, all of our tech partners, right? If you're the soil sampling company or you're the company providing us, some kind of data feed, you're relying on our business succeeding. And so if they have any ranches in their networks, they often refer them to us. So we have we have 32 different partners who have referred us a ranch. And that's sometimes tech partners, that's local nonprofits. Local nonprofits love it because we can go in on a grant with them and we can revenue share or cost share, right? Grant, you're much more likely to win a grant if you can bring some money to the table as well. So we partner with nonprofits in that way, or local ranching community groups. And so we have a number of different angles that we really engage with ranchers. And then once they start hearing about their communities, we already now see inbound. So our first cohort of ranches was entirely outbound, us reaching out to them. Now our second cohort, we already have about 25% of his people inbound reaching out to us who we had not known before.
And in terms of, like the revenue model, is it, there's like one time upfront, like sort of like onboarding and like consulting fees, and then like a product-based fee going forward that's more recurring, or sort of like, and, how does that actually work? Is there actually like revenue sharing with some of the carbon credits? Kind of curious about how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have no cost entry for the rancher to participate in the program. We take 30% of the profit from the carbon sale. So we basically, our partners, so our largest deal right now is with Shell. So the energy company, they provide us a lot of capital up front. So they've already basically paid us for the first few years, or first, 2-3 years of issuances. And what that allows us to do is that we paid for $1 million of soil samples. We paid for ranch advisory. We paid for the virtual fencing. We pay for all the cost aspects of the ranch to join the program. And then basically when they generate carbon credits, that gets sold. And then that's paying for those costs. And then we do a 70-30 split. So the rancher gets 70% of the profit, we get 30%. And so basically, in our program, the price of the carbon is already unit economic positive for us. So we are already cash flow positive on the sale of those credits. Our first batch gets issued in 2025, but Shell has already pre-funded that money. So they've already bought them and sent us the money in advance. And then we just give them those credits as they're issued.
You mentioned sort of, earlier in the interview that you're sort of interested in, I guess, making this more of like a productized element to be able to go to smaller ranches. Is that sort of like your main sort of path to expansion in the future, or is it, further geographic expansion, whether in other states within the U.S. or other countries? Curious about where you guys are thinking about taking business.
Yeah, absolutely. We think about growth really on three lenses. One is within the U.S. or within our existing market, and that's expanding to a greater, reach of ranches, higher diversity of them, et cetera. Absolutely. Again, as we can gather more data and as the price of carbon rises, et cetera, that enables us to access a lot of ranches. Right now, 10% of the ranches own 50% of the land. Right. And so there's still plenty. There's hundreds of millions of acres. I mean, less than 0.1% of land is in these carbon programs. So there's huge amounts of growth that we could do just purely with our existing target market in the United States, but we still think it's important to expand. The other one, as you mentioned, is obviously the international angle. There's a lot of places that actually even have better soils than the United States do for this. And the other thing is often those countries, the land is cheaper. So the value of the carbon per acre is much more of an incentive, right? If your land is worth $10,000 an acre, then getting paid $10 an acre for the carbon is not that attractive. If your property is worth $100 an acre, getting paid $10 an acre is significant, right? And so we do think about that factor. The areas that are attractive are what's called the Chaco in Paraguay and the Pampas region in Argentina or Brazil. Huge amounts of cattle, very, very rich soils. And so these present an opportunity. The other natural expansion is looking at Australia, huge beef market, and it's vertically integrated there. So from cow-calf all the way through feedlot and slaughter are actually all tend to be with the same company. And so they have just much more control of the cattle location and all that. And so there's some really quite large properties and herds out there. They have properties that are 1 million acres. For perspective, that's bigger than Rhode Island. So they have quite large, there's a lot of land in Australia. So there's a number of international expansions. We'll obviously also get to Canada and Mexico are pretty natural expansions that we'll hit in 2025. And the third angle that I think is really important to highlight is, often we'll actually call ourselves a natural capital company. There's a huge growing carbon. It's just the easiest proxy today. And that's where it's countable. Everyone agrees on what a ton of carbon is for the most part, and it's tradable, right? And so that's created liquidity and that makes it easy. We've started to recognize that carbon isn't everything. And so we're looking at water quality, water quantity. It's becoming important. And then biodiversity is the other one. There's now entire United Nations gatherings, COPs on just biodiversity, right? I think the most upcoming one is going to be in Colombia this year. And so really for us, we're working with the largest landholders in the world, right? Our properties we have one property we work with, it's 160,000 acres, right? And so they have a lot on their property that's valuable beyond just carbon. And if we can help them capture that and validate that, and there's companies that are interested in that, if Nestle or Microsoft or JP Morgan wants to invest in biodiversity, not just carbon, then we can really help them access that. And so we really see our expanding verticals going into other kind of units that may be valuable on those properties.
Super interesting. And then in terms of, I guess one question I had is, obviously like carbon credits and a lot of sustainability related companies are incredibly like impacted by regulation, right? The fact that there is a carbon market where you can trade these credits is, somewhat of a regulatory derivative. And I'm sure, there are acts. I don't know if the IRA necessarily impacted what you guys were doing, but kind of curious about your thoughts on sort of like regulation, maybe exposure to future regulation risk,
Sure.
I know what happens on the election in November, and whether you think that, maybe the market has become so robust enough for carbon credits that it doesn't necessarily actually need to just survive on sort of like pro sustainability regulation, and just kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. So the voluntary carbon market is large enough at this point, and the amount of public commitments by the Fortune 500, I mean, they've publicly committed to about 4 billion tons by 2030 in reductions, and they're not even close. And to be honest, 97% of the credits issued in the market today are avoidance credits. So they are preventing forest areas from being cut down, and they get credit for the net. It's a double negative, right? It's saying this would have been lost, and so we prevented that loss.
Sure.
Companies are starting to really diversify what they look for. And so we have a huge upswing potential. We have a number of benefits to us. One, we're removal credits, where we are taking carbon out of the air, putting it in the soil, not just preventing the loss of it. We are US based, which is a huge lift right now because there's a lot of credits in Africa and South America. And there's questions on, do they have proper tribal approvals, land rights, and also just, validation verification. Are they actually taking real measurements? There's a number of kind of questions in some of those markets that, and that benefits the US product for us. But ultimately, again, these companies have made massive, massive commitments. And so we don't really see those going away. They're already spending, hundreds of millions or, over $1 billion on some of these projects. And so again, we think that's gotten to a scale that it gives us a lot of stability. We think that regulation, especially informed regulation, can help. So we do see some regulated markets. Europe has a regulated market and credits sell for $100 plus a ton there. Australia has a market and it even has grasslands projects specifically defined in their market. They've had a lot of troubles. There's questions on the scientific quality of government regulated programs, et cetera. But at the same time, it's at least pushed in some place, and that's allowed a lot of funding. So Australia is way further ahead on grasslands projects than we are, right? And so I think that, ultimately that regulation can help. What we saw in May is that the Treasury Secretary formally announced that the U.S. is going to provide guidelines for quality carbon credits. And they list a lot of things that we already do. We have extremely, extremely high quality credits. We spend a lot more money than is necessary because we believe that eventually those low quality programs are going to get washed out. And we already saw that in the forestry. A lot of forestry programs got washed out. Tracking the cow's GPS location is not a requirement. We do it anyways because we think it can help really validate and verify the program. Otherwise, it's a written affidavit saying I moved my cows. How cares that if that person's the person getting paid, right? And so we do a lot of extra steps and we think that will help us. Obviously, regulation can go in terrible directions or can become overly restrictive, et cetera. So that's something we're watching. The U.S. Department of Agriculture just put out an RFI to better understand what they should be looking at in carbon credits. And we submitted a joint effort with a number of our tech partners. We saw submissions by great groups like World Wildlife Fund as well. So we think that will benefit. The IRA bill also benefited us. And one of the cool things, the nice things about our industry is that it's got bipartisan support because on one side it's climate, which has one side of the aisle, and the other side is we're supporting rural communities. Right. If we're getting more money into the hands of folks in those communities, that's one side of the aisle as well, for the most part. And so we have pretty strong bipartisan support to continue getting money into these programs. And so the IRA bill put $2 billion into the USA to do what's called climate smart commodities. And we're part of one of those grants now for, it had $35 million behind the grant winner that we work with. And so, again, there's a number of these programs that, we think will continue to grow in size.
The final question I sort of have is, given that we are an MBA podcast and we have a lot of students listening, is, going into carbon credits and in particular, like whether it's related to ranchland, but even not related to, like ranching in the specific field that you're in. I think a lot of MBAs would say, I don't necessarily have like this scientific or technical background to sort of enter into that field. But obviously you did it yourself, right? And came from sort of a traditional business background into the space. So was there any sort of lessons along the way that you learned that you think would be applicable for people kind of coming from a background similar as yourself to getting, whether involved in carbon credits more generally or just, in sustainability related companies or startups?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I benefited greatly that my co-founder is a technical one. I think that's always necessary. I think starting something on your own, if you had no technical grasp of the science you're working in, is going to be hard if you're going to go into batteries or geothermal or any of those things. If you didn't know, the basics of the science, I think that's definitely going to be a harder aspect. But, again, I was fortunate to have the benefit of my co-founder being technical. And then, I've really ramped up on understanding the carbon side of things and the soil science and all those other aspects. And I think that's just something that comes with being a founder. But I would say the biggest thing is that for us to grow the climate space, we need more business people. And I know people don't want to hear that all the time. No industry wants to hear more business people coming in the door. But ultimately, if we're going to scale carbon credits and other nature-based markets and really make an impact, you have to make it a profitable or valuable enterprise, right? It has to be something that Shell and Microsoft and JP Morgan want to put $1 billion behind. And they're not going to do that out of charity. They won't, right? That's just not a reality. And we can hope for that. We can hope that everyone starts recycling, but that clearly hasn't worked, right? So if you really want to move things forward, I really believe strongly you have to create proper markets, proper incentives, validation, quantification, all these aspects. And I think that's what we're seeing in the market today. And that's what we were able to do. That's why we believe in the data so much. That's why we spend a lot of money on it. And we are starting to see the rewards from that. And a lot of that came from my knowledge of hardware scaling, my knowledge of how do you create business, how do you create incentives. And, we signed an 8-figure deal with Shell 3 days into our company existing because we had been working with them because we really understood, how that side of the business worked and how we could really create an incentive for them to participate.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. This has been super interesting. Definitely sort of not a typical type of company we interview. So I think it will actually be quite interesting, and I'm really excited to see the response from the listeners. So thank you so much again for your time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Julian.